Japan just spent over $270 billion on energy it didn't plan for, and almost no one outside of energy markets noticed. It didn't happen because of war, it didn't happen because of sanctions, it didn't happen because of bad leadership. It happened because of one earthquake, one wave, one day that changed the entire trajectory of global energy. And here's the thing, Japan is one of the world's most organized, most technologically advanced economies on the planet. If this could happen to them, it can happen anywhere. Because what this story is really about isn't Japan. It's about what happens when any country, any economy loses control of its own energy supply. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to see the global energy system very differently. For decades, Japan had what looked like the perfect energy plan. By the late 2000s, nuclear energy had become a stable source of baseload electricity for Japan's industrial economy, supplying around 26 to 30% of national electricity generation and reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels. Policymakers were planning to expand the nuclear share further, targeting around 40% of electricity generation by 2017. Clean, reliable, domestically controlled. Think about what that means for a country that imports virtually all of its fossil fuels. Nuclear power was Japan's path to energy independence. Picture Kenji, a 6-7-year-old engineer who spent his career helping build that system. He used to say nuclear was Japan's backbone, the one thing Japan could count on in a world where oil could be weaponized and prices could spiral overnight. For 40 years, that logic held. Until the 11th of March 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake struck off the northeastern coast of Japan. It triggered a massive tsunami, and that tsunami hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The disaster caused multiple reactor meltdowns, forced the evacuation of more than 100,000 residents, and fundamentally altered public trust in nuclear power. And that's when everything changed, fast. In the months that followed Fukushima, Japan did something almost unthinkable. Japan progressively shut down its entire nuclear fleet for safety inspections and regulatory review. Nuclear generation, previously a pillar of the electricity system, fell rapidly, eventually reaching zero in 2014 when the last reactors went offline. Zero. A country that generated nearly 30% of its power from nuclear reactors was now at zero. The lights still had to stay on, factories still had to run, homes still needed heat in winter. To compensate for the sudden loss of nearly a third of its electricity supply, Japan turned heavily toward thermal generation, particularly liquefied natural gas, coal, and oil-fired power plants. This shift significantly increased fossil fuel imports, raised electricity costs, and pushed national greenhouse gas emissions upward during the early and mid-2010s. Without significant nuclear power, Japan was self-sufficient for just 6% of its energy demand in 2012, compared with 20% in 2010. Let that sink in. From 20% self-sufficient to 6%. LNG imports in 2011 increased by nearly 25%. Oil use went up by nearly 85%. And all of that costs money, a staggering amount of money. Japan spent 60% more for fossil fuel imports in 2013 compared to 2010, an increase of $270 billion over 3 years. This reversed Japan's trade surplus and created a widening trade deficit, $270 billion in additional fuel costs. In 3 years, domestic energy users saw a 19.4% increase in their energy bills between 2010 and 2013, while industrial users saw their costs rise 28.4% over the same period. And that money, all of it went somewhere. Someone was ready. While Japan was scrambling to keep its lights on, Australia was quietly building one of the most extraordinary energy export booms in modern history. Australia's LNG export capacity increased from 2.6 billion cubic feet per day in 2011 to more than 11.4 billion cubic feet per day in 2019. That's more than a 300% increase in 8 years. 8 entirely new LNG projects came online. Western Australia, Queensland, the Northern Territory. Australia was building at a pace the world hadn't seen. By exporting an estimated record 77.5 million tons of locally produced LNG in 2019, Australia edged out the former #1 LNG export title holder, Qatar. Australia's 2019 LNG exports were more than twice those of the United States, the world's largest LNG exporter. And who is one of the biggest buyers? Japan. Margaret lives in a town in Western Australia she'd called home for 72 years. For most of her life, it was quiet, rural, off the map. Then the LNG projects arrived. Construction jobs, engineering contracts, infrastructure, property values climbed. The local economy transformed. A sleepy regional town became part of a global energy supply chain worth tens of billions of dollars per year. That's what $270 billion in Japanese energy demand does when it flows across the Pacific. But here's the part the headline misses. This win for Australia came with complications. Australia supplies about 40% of Japan's LNG imports, the largest share of any single country. Australia has been Japan's largest LNG supplier for over a decade. Its share of Japan's total LNG imports more than doubled from 18% in 2012 to 42% in 2023. Think about that trajectory. In 2012, the year after Fukushima, Australia supplied less than 1/5 of Japan's LNG. By 2023, it was nearly half. Japan didn't just become dependent on imported energy. It became deeply dependent on one country, one supply chain, one set of shipping lanes. About 60 to 70% of Japan's power generation comes from imported fossil fuels, which cost the country about 10.7 trillion yen, roughly $68 billion last year alone. Every year, not a one-time cost, an annual bill, $68 billion, gone, because of decisions made in the aftermath of one disaster over a decade ago. And this dependency runs in both directions. Just recently, Japan's industry minister asked Australia to boost LNG output, calling affordable and stable LNG supply from Australia the lifeline of energy security in Japan and this region. When a nation's industry minister is calling another country's LNG its lifeline, that's the definition of strategic dependency. And what happens when the lifeline gets stressed? In 2022, the world got a preview of what energy dependency looks like when global supply chains break. Russia's invasion of Ukraine upended the global gas market. Europe, desperate to replace Russian pipeline gas, turned to LNG from the United States, Australia, and Qatar. As Europe sought to replace Russian gas, it bid up prices of US, Australian, and Qatari shipborne LNG, raising prices and diverting supply away from traditional LNG customers in Asia. European gas prices ultimately peaked at 345 euros per megawatt hour in August 2022, as Russia weaponized its natural gas exports, sparking a cost of living crisis across the continent. And this wasn't just a European problem. Bangladesh had to slash LNG imports at the height of the crisis. Rolling blackouts cut nearly 20% of its power load during peak summer demand. Pakistan faced double-digit inflation, partly driven by energy import costs. Small businesses across Asia saw energy bills double and triple. David owns a small restaurant in Japan. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep a family going. In 2022, his energy costs spiked. He faced a brutal choice: raise prices and lose customers, or keep prices and bleed out. He nearly shut down. That's the human cost of energy dependence. Not just billions on a balance sheet, people making impossible decisions because of forces entirely outside their control. And this was just one crisis, one war, one supply disruption. The lesson from 2022 is clear. In a globalized energy market, a shock anywhere becomes a shock everywhere. Now, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Australia became the world's LNG king, just as the world started seriously questioning whether LNG would stay king. Because something else is happening simultaneously, quietly, and at extraordinary speed. The global weighted average cost of newly commissioned utility-scale solar PV projects declined from $0.46 per kilowatt hour to $0.044 per kilowatt hour between 2010 and in 2023, a decrease of 90%. Solar power is now, in most of the world, the cheapest form of new electricity generation ever built by humanity. Battery storage project costs dropped by 89% between 2010 and 2023. The economics of the old energy order are being rewritten. Japan has been gradually restarting nuclear plants and deploying solar at scale. Fossil fuels accounted for 63% of electricity generation in 2024, back to the share before the 2011 earthquake. Japan's annual LNG imports have fallen 20% since 2018. Japan is slowly, deliberately reducing its dependence, restarting nuclear, building renewables. The very dependency it created after Fukushima is now being unwound. And globally, Australia's largest LNG export market in 2024 was actually China at 33%, not Japan, which came in at 32%. Japan, historically Australia's biggest customer, has been surpassed. Australia's LNG throne isn't gone, but the kingdom is shifting. So why does any of this matter to you? Because energy isn't an abstract commodity. It is the invisible foundation beneath everything in your economy. The price of your food, the cost of manufacturing, the stability of jobs, the ability of a government to fund public services without running deficits. Every time a country gets its energy wrong or gets blindsided by a crisis it didn't plan for ordinary people pay, Japan is now asking some very serious questions. The Japanese government has committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, with renewable energy at the center of its latest energy plan, pushing for greater investments in solar and wind. The government is targeting around 20 to 22% of electricity generation from nuclear by 2030, alongside expansion of renewables with plans to increase battery storage and elevate solar capacity significantly. This is what a country looks like when it decides never to be caught vulnerable again. And Australia faces its own version of this question. How long does the LNG export boom last? What happens as Japan and China reduce demand? What comes after fossil fuels as the source of export revenue? The countries that answer these questions well, that diversify before they're forced to, are the ones that write their own future. The ones that don't pay someone else's price. So here's the real question to sit with. If the country you live in, or the country you're planning to move to, lost its energy supply tomorrow, how exposed would it be? Because Japan had the answer to that question. They thought it was nuclear. Then one wave changed everything. The $270 billion lesson is simple. Dependence is risk. And the most dangerous risks are the ones that look completely safe right up until they aren't. Who do you think controls global energy next? And is your country ready? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.